Okay, so welcome to this episode of the WAN Manager podcast. If you caught last season, we did a few episodes that were with other telegeography analysts where we kind of take a deeper dive on a particular topic. And that is what we're going to be doing today with Erik Kreifeldt talking about internet middle mile. Welcome, Erik.
Thanks, Greg.
Yeah, so often at this part, I like to read out some data points that might make their way into a chart in a blog post or a write-up. This product doesn't really lend itself to that kind of sort of pithy description, but in it, we profile 28 middle mile providers in 5 different categories of provider. So that's what we're going to sort of work through today rather than kind of start with just a bunch of statistics. I thought I'd set up that we're looking at what does this marketplace look like, whether you're from the carrier side or the end user side. It's important to understand not just who the different players are, but kind of what different niches they fill. So we have Erik here, who is the lead analyst on this new product, also called Internet Middle Mile. But before we jump into that, Erik, I wonder if you could just give us a brief explanation of kind of your background and specifically what you do at TeleGeography.
Well, I'm a principal analyst at TeleGeography, and it's sort of a common term in the analyst community, such as it is. And I've been doing this for 15 years, just like you, actually. I think you got me.
We started months apart from each other, didn't we?
I want to say it was about 6 months. And so your anniversary must have just hit, because I want to say mine's about 6 months out for 15 years.
February, so just about when this is airing, I think. Yeah.
And I've worked, kind of done pretty much a tour de force of most of TeleGeography's research lines over the years. And, we focused a lot on the kind of the core network and the wholesale business, but also more recently, enterprise services and that market. At TeleGeography generally, we focus a lot on the commercial aspects of that. And even within TeleGeography, I'm on the team that's focusing on that as opposed to what we would call infrastructure, which is a bit more about network topology and things like that. But
but you've dabbled in that too, right? So
absolutely, yeah. And previous to that, I was also at sort of an industry analyst in different venues, but did a lot of optical networking work before this, which is still relevant. But yeah, that's my background.
So that puts you in a good position to pull back to the scale where we can see this as a part of the larger ecosystem rather than being sort of laser beam focused on as a WAN service specifically, perhaps.
Yeah.
All right, so let's start out here. I'm sure everyone listening to this has used the term middle mile or heard it before, but like many things in telecom that are terms of art, the meaning can very much differ with the mouth that it is emanating from, right? So how are we defining middle mile specifically in this new product?
Oh, I'm actually glad you used the term of art. I mean, I don't like all lawyer terms, but I'm fond of that one. I like it. Yeah. It's actually it's pertinent here because if you actually Google it and look it up. Middle mile, I think it really started more as a term of art for the FCC would use it for really more of a kind of not a universal access, but sort of a broad or kind of an unbundling broad, for business broadband back maybe.
Yeah, the broadband plan.
Exactly. And so it gets kicked around there, and it's not entirely different from that, but just to kind of point that out, that is where you'll first hear of it. And then, it can, maybe there are a couple other things that maybe it isn't quite, on the one hand, we used to talk about, the metro network, which was basically that portion of the network between the core network and the access network. So middle mile and it's a bit that, but it's a little bit more nuanced in this case. I think it's fair to describe it pretty similarly that, it's that portion of the network between, and it's primarily in the context of an enterprise WAN service, that it's between the enterprise's local access to the network and the core network, particularly whatever destination on the core network. Most, foremost among them, a cloud service provider, but it could be something else. So I know that's pretty generic, and we'll break some of those things down, but fairly intuitive enough. And I actually had a colleague when we were talking through this and sorting it out. He said, it almost was easier for me to understand it as middleman, or middle entity.
Interesting. Yeah.
Kind of broker the end user to the applications in the cloud, basically, or hosted otherwise, off prem. And that's another
what you might call a two-sided marketplace, right? Yeah. Absolutely interesting. So you kind of alluded to this, and I've heard you bring it up before in this topic, that really this is a lot about how enterprises connect to the cloud. So there's a cloud geography out there. If you're in, if your office is in Northern Virginia, maybe it's really straightforward to get to the cloud, but most offices aren't necessarily by a huge conglomeration of cloud instances. How does middle mile involve the cloud? In other words, how is it that middle mile providers are connecting to the cloud? And is that different from the way that a sort of traditional telco WAN services provider would look at it?
Right. I think it's fair to break it down in two very basic ways you can connect to the cloud, that an enterprise connect to the cloud. And one is over the internet, and one is more directly with, some version of a, dedicated transport link between your location and your service provider.
Right. And that's where we get more into this morass of terms that, dedicated direct connect has a particular meaning. So we say dedicated connection or something like this, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. And so given those two basic means of connecting to the cloud, what the middle mile sector wants to do is to kind of augment and optimize those methods. So you have some of the operators that are, it's like, okay, you're connecting to the cloud over the internet. Well, the internet isn't perfect. Let's provide some services that augment that to basically make that more robust and a better better connection, better experience, and all that to access applications. And on by the other means, another approach is just to have basically a private network, or some more of an on-net facilities-based type approach, rather than doing it at layer 3 to connect you more, directly. And like you said, you brought up direct connects. It certainly it's very similar to that, and that's where the similarities start in what middle mile would be versus a traditional enterprise network service provider. There's a lot of the same service being provided there, but there with a couple of key differences that we can get into.
Got it. Okay, so sort of thinking through that, if I'm connecting to my cloud through an ISP, say, the ISP then, of course, is presumably dumping my traffic not too long after it picks it up. Or even if I'm using a sort of more like a DIA service or something more local access, traditional oriented, that still has to get from, say, that central office to the AWS instance or whatever the case. So we're looking at the folks who focus on that area. Is that in that scenario, you want to make that journey as efficient as possible. Usually what gets trotted out is that, you're connecting, to the cloud over the internet, and you're at the mercy of the peering fabric that is being utilized by your provider, and frankly, all those upstream providers to it. And you could end up in a scenario where basically your routing could be very inefficient and take many more. If you're trying to get from point A to point Z, you don't want to have to go through B, C, D, E, E, F, G, and all the rest on the way. You would rather just do it in as few hops as possible.
and you can go to that third party that can either sort of scoop up your traffic as soon as you can and kind of carry it more on net, or otherwise sort of ensure that it takes the most efficient path through the internet to get where it needs to go.
Got it. That makes sense. All right. So we have a framework of like what we mean by middle mile, what it's trying to do. I mentioned at the top here that we have, I think it was 28 providers in 5 different categories. Could you break us down what those categories are and how different providers sort of group together in terms of solving this problem?
Sure. And I'll kind of I'll pick up where I started with the 2 basic ways. So you have those that take more of a transport approach. It's more of an on-network approach. On this end of the spectrum, you're kind of talking about network as a service type of network operators, type of service providers that, if you look at it, you think it through, it's like, well, aren't they really just reselling wavelengths? And that's a reasonable conception. But usually what comes with that is a lot more, more value added to that, usually more provisioning and billing dynamism, essentially.
Right. Well, I laugh because that's exactly what I remember when we were trying to figure out what CDNs were. It was just, they're just reselling wavelengths. Like, yeah.
And so, it really, it's a, perhaps a more agile way of doing that. But it's essentially, very kind of purpose built, or application driven means of bandwidth exchange, essentially, or taking on a bandwidth service is one sort of end of the spectrum. And then on a more sort of layer 3 side of things, well, I guess before I go to the layer 3 side, there's also more of rather than the transport part of it, there's also a set of players that are in the co-location business or in the internet exchange business that, hey, we operate facilities that have, effectively, every network operator in the world connected to. Right. Why don't we leverage that toward, you want to connect to the cloud? Well, they're all here, so kind of leveraging those facilities and providing a service that essentially has the whole cloud on the backplane. All you need to do is get connected to that fabric, and they've basically augmented their co-location and internet exchange facilities with transport, to kind of make that happen, and other services to make that link more direct. So that's kind of a second category. And then a third category is more these internet augmentors and there's subcategories therein. You could have a provider that has a fabric of its own, buys a lot of IP transit, puts together basically its own internet backbone, and sort of scoops up its customers' traffic as quick as possible and carries it sort of on net, not really, but within its own sort of peering ecosystem, and routes the traffic efficiently. And then another sort of subcategory that isn't quite as deliberate as that, but a little bit more of an enhanced sort of, kind of probe of where your traffic's going on the internet and steering things accordingly, which brings us to something that'll sound familiar as the SD-WAN community. There's certainly a lot of overlap with internet middle mile providers and SD-WAN providers, particularly a subset of SD-WAN providers that takes that approach in ways that we've already described, that have a bit more of an on-net kind of approach, or if they do it over the top, they're really in there a little bit more involved in the core network rather than just sort of bonding your underlay access into something and then choosing the best route. They're a little bit more involved in remediating the traffic itself.
Right. So you mean like the sort of Ariakas and Katos of the world?
Absolutely.
That
those
have some network. Yeah. Yep. Versus a pure over the top, like say Viptela or Silver Peak or whatever. But for a different leg of the journey, being that SD-WAN is mostly focused on load balancing and forward error correction and things coming out of the office. These are folks that are focused maybe on that, but also on the end-to-end journey more so. Is that
I think that's a fair way to distinguish it. And at some point, it does get a little difficult to distinguish, where the middle mile service stops and the SD-WAN service begins, or the other way around. I mean, there's certainly some overlap, and that's okay. I mean, it's not, it doesn't have to be this, rigid distinction, but
Right.
yeah, there's certainly some overlap there.
All right, so this is the WAN Manager podcast, obviously geared toward the WAN Manager IT infrastructure team, but we also know, of course, that the vendors and telcos listen as well. Is there a play here for them? Is there a difference in kind of how these services might be presented to the provider side versus the end user side, or is it just whether you go direct or rely on your other providers to use this kind of service?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly. I mean, you could argue that the functions are the same, but maybe the use cases are different, or just the perspectives are. One's kind of on one side of the equation, and maybe one's on the other. I think from the perspective of a WAN manager, from that of from the WAN, from the corporate network, here is a class of service provider that's trying to distinguish itself from the traditional enterprise service provider, which, if you think about it, can essentially provide much the same thing in terms of connectivity, but there's just these key elements of differentiation that it's, more of a purpose-built network and service. The use cases are a bit more well-defined and discrete, rather than being more universal in the case of a telco. And so I guess that would be the view accordingly. From here's another, service provider in the marketplace to serve that need, and especially if you get into things like maybe probably the chief use case here really is not just cloud connectivity, but multi-cloud connectivity. And now we can start to pick apart. We've already touched on with direct cloud connects. They've been around a while, but to do multiple cloud connects with sort of that kind of aggregation and presenting you, the WAN customer, a sort of one connection, and you can get to many cloud providers otherwise directly, rather than have a series of bilateral direct connection, that becomes a bit more special and one of the propositions. And you can look at that also from the network operator side. If you're a big carrier and don't have and can certainly provide direct cloud connects, maybe you can take advantage of a vendor in this space that can provide that multi-cloud connectivity, and you can just kind of use them as one of your network partners.
Right. Well, that gives me a good chance in this episode to pull in a data point that I have top of mind, which is that I think we have about 3 in 4 of the enterprises that we've asked have at least 2 infrastructure as a service partners, which is usually Azure and AWS, which have a fairly similar geographic footprint. So, like, needing to get to those same places, but needing to get to maybe different facilities and that sort of thing. So, definitely relevant is the point there. So, yeah. So you mentioned some kind of use cases there in terms of multi-cloud. If you're talking to, say, a WAN manager who's like, oh, this is interesting, I hadn't really necessarily thought explicitly about middle mile before. I've been managing an MPLS network, right? And things are, the ground is shifting underneath me. Where do you think that they should start in kind of incorporating these kinds of vendors into their strategy? And how would you kind of sort them into one of these different categories? Is it based on what their transport technologies are now, maybe, or are there some other factors to think about?
There's even a couple of categories of factor to think about. And I think you've already touched on 2 of them. In terms of sort of the network you have and what you're maybe migrating to, you can look at it from, well, what are you trying to accomplish? If you're all in on the cloud, and really your network need really comes down to just the most, efficient, broadly defined and robust connection to your cloud providers, then this may well be worth a close look, because it's kind of this narrower use case, really. And
Mm-hmm.
from the other point of view, that if your network is architected a certain way, then maybe you would start to look at the different categories of these operators that look at their provenance and what they've kind of come up through. Were they in the WAN optimization business? Were they in the transport business? Were they in some
Right.
SD-WAN? Some aspect of this, and that kind of matches the way you like to run your network. That's another way to kind of get involved with one of these suppliers, and it just may be a service so you're using them for something else, and they offer you this service. For example, a great example is it's not a lot of WAN managers are peering that run autonomous system numbers and networks and are actually part of the internet in the formal definition. But if you are, that would certainly point to working with one of these more internet exchange type options where you're kind of taking a more peering based approach. Just for example, if you're set up that way, so sort of both an application and goal sort of based approach of decision making, and also a more of a topologically driven one, and just kind of how and I guess, as always with any of these services, what is your in-house sort of capability and appetite for dealing with these things? Do you have more of a transport based kind of view on these things, or do you really want to just have a bunch of internet connections and let it all sort itself out? Well, then you might still want to have a look at one of these augmentation strategies, and those would point to directions you would want to look.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you bring that up. We've looked at this before, just in terms of enterprises that have done maybe a benchmark with us or interacted with us in a deeper way, and we get an understanding of their team before, and it really runs the gamut. That we've had customers who have 10,000 plus sites around the world that's literally managed by a team of like barely more than half a dozen or so, and then you have others that have several hundred sites around the world, but have almost essentially turned into a mini telco, because they kind of piece their network together. But it sounds to me like what you're saying is that may sort you into one of these different categories, but no one is necessarily excluded from benefiting from some part of this ecosystem, if you will.
I think that's fair, and I would even extend that back to the dialogue we were having about kind of how the network operator community itself, or carriers and others that could also stand to benefit from some aspect of this, in addition to WAN operators.
Very interesting. Yeah. All right. So here, I know that you love / hate this question. So I'm looking forward to / apologize for it. But it's one we get asked all the time, and that I know you have thoughts on. I see this very much connected to the dissolution of the MPLS hold on the definition of a WAN, in moving into different ways of using applications and data. Again, to bring in another data point to this from the WAN Manager survey, only 1 out of 10 of the enterprises we asked last year, 2019 actually, indicated that they have all of their data centers on premises, right? So almost everyone is dealing with some amount of off-premises data center. All of that leads toward a world that looks very different in terms of the transport technologies that we can use, and how much MPLS will be the center of the WAN. So in regards to the kinds of solutions that these middle miles providers can offer, do you think this is another sort of knock against the armor of MPLS? So what do you see the development of MPLS being over the next few years?
Well, as you know, we've certainly entertained that question before, as you teed this up, and
Yes,
let me try and put it this way, Greg. If I told you that I had a service that could handle multiple protocols, and they could be labeled in such a way and switched through the network very efficiently, would you be interested in that?
I like that.
And it looks, smells, and tastes like our old friend, and at a higher level, what we've just described is more or less that use case, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So not to be too overly clever, but I guess the point is that yes, it is a substitute, but it's a substitute almost at a higher level. As I was saying, if you have these boiled down to some pretty discrete use cases of I need to connect to a few CSPs or a few locations in a certain way, that's a higher order reason why you would be moving away from a VPN. Never mind
Mm-hmm.
MPLS. But on the other
Right.
hand, if you're taking a more internet based approach, well, you're kind of well. A lot of these folks aren't completely transparent, of course, about what their secret sauce is on precisely how they accomplish this augmentation. And it stands
Right.
to reason you're perhaps using MPLS or something very much like it. So you're not
Mm-hmm.
really getting away from it. And we've been here before with this question. It's really the traditional MPLS VPN that's under the big threat, and the MPLS itself. There's a couple of ways to articulate it. Like if you're getting DIA from one of the tier one backbone providers, you're sort of getting all the goodness of MPLS anyway. You get into things like that.
Right.
And
Right.
so
Yeah.
it's not quite the raw substitution like an MPLS killer or something. And even the SD-WAN market has gotten away from that as well.
Mm-hmm.
I would say similarly, I probably wouldn't frame it that way here either. And indeed, there's probably as many similarities as there are contrasts.
Right. Right. That makes sense. And I mean, the extension of that question that comes up sometimes is that uh, when we're going to a world SD-WAN on the edge, security on the edge, we'll leave that for some other time, right? As I know you're particularly fond of the term that I won't bring up. That was sarcasm, folks, but yes, that then you're interacting. Most of your data, most of your applications now are something that are not hosted or designed by a lot of enterprises. Some certainly, still going to have their own dev teams, but even that they might be using platform as a service more so, and even if they're doing proprietary stuff. Point being that some people, especially on the WAN manager end, which I find fascinating, are coming to me and saying, "Is there really going to be a WAN anymore in a few years?" And I think it's kind of a philosophical question, but what do you think about that? And is being able to optimize kind of the middle mile part of that progression or evolution?
Well, again, I'm trying to resist being overly clever here, but I
Mm-hmm.
almost feel like the way I want to kind of what pops into my head to address that question is that yeah, it's almost like we moved toward VPNs, which were a revolution in their day, because we used to have to do basically our own mesh of point-to-point circuits, which was what they call.
Redundant, SDH
Yeah,
circuits, yeah.
yeah, and now or E1s or whatever, yeah. The point
Right,
is you're just
right,
transport links, to make your own network, and so the VPN was this, revolutionary thing where it was all virtual, and you get your port, and you could kind of get through the mesh, abstracted. I almost feel like this is swinging a little bit back toward that.
hmm
And again, we've talked about layer three approaches to this. It's not entirely going back to the world of discrete deterministic routes between
right,
your locations, but a big segment of this has been born of that, which we didn't really mention. But a lot of this data center interconnect and some of these big pipes between
right.
these big places. This is you're tapping into that market, and it's almost kind of going back that way. So in that sense, no, it's not really a demise of the WAN in that sense. It's almost a return to its origins in a
Right.
way. But I guess you could also frame that as an abandonment of this more virtual. I don't know. It's a kind of a high concept question, and there's maybe a high concept answer that because there are other approaches that I guess I just this isn't necessarily a one for one substitute for a VPN, as it's
Right.
really more. But it does sort of check off a lot of the things you would accomplish with a WAN. Like, okay, I have, I basically entities out on a network that I need to reach as robustly as possible. And I guess it's just not quite as universal in this sense. It's a bit more well defined and more purpose built, rather than the more universal notion of a VPN. I hope that still makes sense. I don't want to run too far.
No, it totally does. I think that where I sit on that is maybe even more vague, but it's kind of like in the end, if you are doing private proprietary activity, however one achieves that, right? Some mix of SD-WAN and I'll say it SASE and cloud services and all that. In the end, it to me seems like almost a semantic issue about whether there's a WAN or not. Like, is it exactly what we meant by WAN by an extension of what a LAN was? Maybe not, but there's still a sort of philosophical thing, right? That one still has to manage, even if manage means something different than it used to. That's kind of where I fall on that. Although I'm open to interpretation.
It is. I think it is an interesting way to. I think it's still useful, despite being largely semantic. I do think it's still worth something, because you mentioned, at its heart, what is the WAN? Well, it's wide instead of local. I mean, what was a LAN? Like, how'd you build a LAN? Well, you strung some, Cat5 cable, and you put in some routers, and it's just, this is just on a more global scale is the WAN. And I think, and that's why I was sort of going back to that notion of, well, we're sort of doing that again, and that's still a WAN, or it's not, if you're thinking of it in a different way, that, if I guess maybe the not WAN is really more just, okay, I'm just going to go onto the internet and again, come what may. But what in the context of a middle mile, we're harnessing that, we're controlling that, we're augmenting that, which pulls us back into something more of a WAN. I mean, again, whether it's in the context of SD-WAN or middle mile, some of these operators are taking that approach. All they're really doing is taking the internet and bringing it onto a private network. That's not really,
or tunneling it in a specific way that again pulls you out of just being public internet per se.
And I think that's more WAN than not WAN in our sort of conceptual discussion here.
That makes perfect sense to me. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground. If we could sort of wrap up on just from, again, that kind of WAN manager, IT infrastructure team perspective, do you think there are any key takeaways from what you kind of picked up putting all of this product together in terms of I didn't really mention what the product was, did I? But we profile all of these different providers and then kind of explain where they fit in to the ecosystem. I think you've talked about making some really cool kind of sort of network flow charts to explain it. But can you distill out of all that work maybe a couple of key takeaways that you would hope WAN managers can go home with?
Yeah, having not quite completely finish it yet, I can try.
Yeah, very close. I better
finish it soon, because this is going to. I think one of them is that there is this category of service provider out there. Okay, that's not your traditional enterprise WAN service provider, and it's also not just a cloud service provider either. I mean, there's several things I guess we didn't have time to cover, but there is sort of this there is this purpose-built option out there for cloud connectivity, kind of dedicated to that you can also purpose for not just the cloud, but things other things on a network that is sort of a non-telco option, I guess, is the one in its most basic form.
Right.
Another is that, conceding to just use the internet is not the end of that story. You can actually do that and still have plenty of options to augment that and kind of make that actually ameliorate some of the disadvantages of going that way with some services that are out there.
Right.
And this is a way. I guess another way to part of those differentiations of this segment is that it is, if not greenfield, it's purpose built. It's more agile to develop some of the latest technologies and software defined networking and things like that. And that if you're looking for those things, here's a sector to look in that may have some feature sets that are of interest, and some just having good interfaces for those as well. They're really working
Right.
on those areas of differentiation, which in some ways may not be all that profound or revolutionary, but could really be quite useful for the day-to-day WAN manager who just, geez, can I just have a half decent interface, please? And there's
Right.
a lot of that here. A lot of like, hey, drop down menu, hit the thing you want, and a lot of billing creativity. Again, we didn't even get into that, but
I was going to say, yeah, that's one key thing here,
yeah,
right? Is the possibility of avoiding some of the long-term vendor lock-in kind of stuff with MPLS. It becomes
yeah,
and
and just
the provisioning, right? Yeah. So
yes, yeah, those are the two. Yeah, real quickly, the billing more or less is aligned with what you're getting from the cloud folks, and so you don't have this mismatch of long term sort of contracts with these by minute type charges. They're brought more into alignment, and like you said, with the provisioning, and that was really one of the knocks on VPNs, was that one of them was the provisioning issue, and with these more modern networks with more software defined aspects to them, you can take advantage of those things and just have more agility to turn things up, shut things down, spin things up, that we've had more in the IT space for quite some time. And this was the original promise of another, I guess, pithy way to put it, is that this is some of the first round of commercialization of software defined networking, really.
yeah, that's I've never thought of it that way. That's an interesting way to close. Excellent. All right. So when this podcast comes out in a few weeks, we'll probably be pretty close to releasing that product, and maybe have some blog posts about it if folks want to learn more. But Erik, before we finish, I always like to have a sort of more fun question in here, and I decided, I've always envied your hobby, fishing. I have a very low threshold for boredom, and I'm extremely impatient. So my fishing excursions end up being short and frustrating. But you are an expert fisherman, so I want to hear your best fishing story.
Oh, wow. My best.
Yeah, I should have warned you about that, but yeah.
Yeah, this was not in the preparation
Yeah.
that we agreed on, which I guess is what it makes it so brilliant. Oh man, best fish story. I'm trying to think. Something pops to mind, but I'm trying to make it as concise as any good fish story. It's a
Of
long
course.
yarn, but I suppose I went on a float trip. So I took a canoe and went down the
Ooh,
White
fun.
River in Michigan.
Mhm.
Guy dropped me off. I went by myself, floated down the river, had a pickup arranged at the other end, and I realized I couldn't fish that well from the boat underway, so I
Mm.
would beach it and fish likely looking spots. And at one point, I was fishing this bend in the river like you do, and I hooked into a fish, and it was a beauty. It was, usually if you're really good, you can tell what it is before it even surfaces. But the fish
Right.
surfaces, I could tell it was a big northern pike, and I had never caught a big northern pike, and I really wanted to
Right.
catch this northern pike. And so I'm wading in the water. So I'm in the water, and I'm up to a certain level, and this is a pretty deep hole, and he's fighting as the fish will do. And I noticed that he takes a run down the river, and he wraps me around a log.
Oh no.
And I'm looking, and I
That's a
know what's
smart
going to happen.
that's a smart northern pike. Yeah.
I have about a split second that he's gonna, now the tension is on the line, and he is going to snap off if
Right.
I don't act. And I thought, okay, in a split second, I did an inventory. I had my matches in my pocket, and I just the fish was more important. And I waded into the river to get the fish and stick my rod, and reached as best I could to get unwound from the branch, and he was gone. I lost.
Oh no! So you lost your matches and the fish.
It's a sad fish story, Greg. I could have gone, and so that night it was a very cold night in the tent with no campfire because I had lost my matches, and that I had wetted my matches, and so I was visiting some relatives, and my aunt gave me the gift of waterproof matches after.
Yeah. Or, a lighter, just to throw that out there for future.
That's my fish story. A little bit of a downer, but I've never forgotten it for sure.
No, it's a great one. I love it. Awesome. All right. Well, this was super fun. Thank you so much. And we'll do this again sometime when we have the next thing coming up.
All right. Thanks, Greg.
Bye. Thanks very much for listening. The WAN Manager podcast is brought to you by TeleGeography, a division of Primetrica Incorporated, and is edited and produced by Jane Miller. I wrote the theme song you're listening to right now, and we get administrative canine support from my dog Honeybun, who you might hear chiming in from time to time when the mood strikes her. If you want to learn more about our data, head over to telegeography.com, where you can find our blog that covers many of the topics we hit here, and you can sign up for our WAN Manager newsletter. Until next time, have a great day.